The morning Emilio Vargas left the dust moon of Cerro Verde, his mother pressed a folded square of cloth into his palm and told him not to open it until he was hungry enough to weep. He was 19. The cloth smelled of cumin and old smoke and the inside of her apron pocket, and he tucked it against his chest beneath the patched thermal liner the company had issued him at 14, when they decided his shoulders were wide enough to crawl into the ore shafts. He did not look back at the cluster of prefab huts squatting against the red rim of the crater. He did not look at the radio tower where his father had died. He looked only at the freighter hulking on the launch pad and at the long ramp climbing into its belly, and he walked. His sister Lucia had been taken 6 standard weeks earlier. The Cerro Verde administrator had said the words in the order administrators always said them. An investigation was underway. The matter had been referred. The relevant authorities would be in contact. Emilio had stood in the man's small office with his hat in his hands and watched the man's mouth moving and understood that no one was coming. The relevant authorities lived 4 jump gates away in the towers of Valcaron, the capital of the conquered, and the relevant authorities did not come to dust moons for the daughters of ore pickers. So Emilio sold his father's tools. He sold the brass crucifix his grandmother had carried across 2 colonies. He sold the boots he had been saving for his wedding, which he had not yet planned and now would not have, and he bought passage on the freighter as deck labor. The captain, a thick-necked Tellurian with 3 rings in each ear, looked him over once and grunted. "You ever been off-world, kid?" "No, sir." "You ever seen a Virethi?" "In pictures." The captain laughed without smiling. "Pictures don't do it." The crossing took 9 days. Emilio slept in a hammock strung between 2 coolant pipes and worked 16 hours of every 20, scraping carbon scale from the freighter's belly and hauling crates that smelled of fish oil and ozone. The other deckhands were 3 Tellurians, a 1-armed pelt, and a human woman named Marisol who had been making the run for 11 years and who looked at Emilio's young face on the first morning and said, gently, "Whatever you came for, kid, it's already gone." He did not answer her. He worked. At night he lay in the hammock and held the folded cloth against his chest and thought of his sister's laugh, which was crooked because of a tooth she had broken at 7, and he did not weep because he was not yet hungry enough. The pelt was called Hesh. He had lost his arm, he told Emilio on the 3rd night, to a Virethi freight clamp 7 years earlier, when he had been working a dock crew that no one had bothered to tell the schedule had changed. The clamp had come down. He had been slow. The dock surgeon had been a Tellurian who did not like pelts, and the stitching had gone bad, and by the time Hesh had been able to afford the prosthetic, the stump had healed wrong and the socket would not seat. So he worked 1-armed. He was, despite this, faster than 2 of the Tellurians, and he taught Emilio the trick of bracing crates with the hip when both hands were full. And he taught him also, more importantly, that the universe did not care which of its small creatures lost which of their small parts, and that a man's job was to keep working with what was left. "You are very young," Hesh said on the 7th night, watching Emilio splice a coolant hose. "Too young for what you are going to." "How young is too young?" Hesh considered. "Younger than the city is old." Emilio laughed. It was the first time he had laughed since leaving Cerro Verde, and the sound surprised him. It surprised Hesh too, who looked up sharply, the long pelt ears flattening, and then lifting in what Emilio would later learn was a smile. "Good," said Hesh. "Keep that, you will need it." On the 9th day, the freighter dropped out of the jump, and Emilio saw Valcaron for the first time. Nothing his mother had told him, nothing the company hollows had shown him, nothing in the religious tracts the missionaries had left at the crater rim had prepared him. The city was not a city. It was a planet that had eaten itself and grown back as architecture. Towers the size of mountain ranges braided into each other through the cloud deck. Skylanes glittered between them like threads of luminous insects. There was no ground that he could see, only the lower vaults sinking into a perpetual amber smog that the deckhands called the throat. Above all of it, ringed in slow rotation, the great orbital citadels of the conquered patrol fleets hung against the stars like beads on a wire. Marisol came up beside him at the porthole and watched him watching. "First rule," she said, "don't look up." "Why?" "You'll never stop." She gave him the address of a flophouse in the lower Cinder district, where humans could sleep 4 to a cot for half a chit a night, and she told him which street markets had food that wouldn't kill him and which had food that would. She told him the names of the 3 gangs that ran the dock wards and which colors not to wear and which alleys not to enter even in daylight. She told him that if he ever heard the word *Sethan spoken behind him, he should run, and not look back, and not stop running until his lungs gave out. "What's Sethan?" "Slavers' Virethi word, the kind that take humans." He nodded. He thanked her. He walked down the ramp into the cargo bay of Valkyron Port 17 with his thermal liner and his folded cloth and 42 chits in a pouch sewn into his waistband, and within the hour he was lost. The port was a city by itself. 10,000 species moved through it in tides that knew rhythms he could not read. He stood at the mouth of a corridor watching a procession of Sithari priests glide past on their wheeled platforms, robes brushing the deck plates, and he stepped backward to give them room, and a freight loader, the size of a house, nearly took his head off. A human woman in a port uniform dragged him out of the way by the collar and screamed at him in a language he did not know. He apologized in Spanish and then in Common, and then he simply walked on, because there was nowhere to stand still. He showed his sister's hollow at the customs desk. A pelt clerk barely looked at it. "Trafficking inquiries are filed at Tower 11, Concord Bureau. Intake floors 30 through 40. Take ticket. Wait." "Next." "How long is the wait?" "Average current backlog is 4 standard years." The next person in line was already pushing him aside. He walked out of the port at sundown, which on Valkyron was a moment, not an hour, the sky going from amber to copper to black between one breath and the next, and he stood on a pedestrian skyway looking down into a canyon of light 1,000 stories deep, and he understood, for the first time, that he had come to a place that did not know he existed and would never need to. He found the flophouse. He paid for a cot. He ate half a strip of something the vendor called protein and slept with his pouch tied to his wrist. The flophouse was called the Pillar, though there was no pillar, only a stack of welded shipping containers that had been retrofitted with thin partitions and thinner mattresses, 80 cots to a tier, 4 tiers high. The air smelled of unwashed bodies and the sweet rot of cheap synthkef and the metal tang of recycled water. Somewhere on his tier, a man was coughing the slow, wet cough that on Cerro Verde had meant lung rust. Somewhere on the tier below, 2 voices were arguing in a language Emilio did not recognize. Somewhere far away, beyond all of it, the city was making the deep, continuous hum he would come to understand was the sound of Valkyron itself, the breathing of a thing too large to ever fully sleep. He slept badly. He dreamed of the kitchen at home. His mother was pressing masa, and Lucia was sitting at the table cutting paper into shapes with the small scissors their grandmother had left behind, and the kitchen was warm, and the light through the window was the soft red of the crater at dawn, and his father was alive, and somewhere outside the dogs were barking. He woke at the false sunrise the flophouse's lights simulated and lay for a long moment trying to keep the dream inside his chest before it dissolved. It dissolved anyway. Dreams always did. In the morning, he began to look. He had a single hollow of Lucia, 14, smiling crooked, wearing the yellow scarf their mother had woven the winter the heater failed. He had her last message, 3 sentences long, sent from a transit hub 2 systems over before the signal went dark. He had the name of the trafficker the Cerro Verde administrator had refused to chase, a Virethi broker called Esrescal, who was said to keep an office somewhere in the Cinder under a false name. He had 40 chits left. He started with the day labor pits. The lower cinder humans gathered at dawn in a converted hangar called the Yard, where alien foremen leaned from balconies and pointed down into the crowd, picking out shoulders and backs and hands. Emilio learned to stand where the light fell on his face. He learned to nod without speaking. He learned that if you worked a full shift hauling cargo for a Tellurian crew, you ate. If the foreman was a Virethi, you ate less and bled more. If the foreman was Sithari, you sometimes did not come back. He worked. He asked. He asked everyone. He asked the old human who slept under the recycler in the Yard, who had been a mining engineer once and now spoke only in fragments of a hymn. He asked the boy who ran messages for the dock gangs, who was 12 and missing 2 fingers. He asked the woman who ran the noodle cart at the corner of Vault 9, who fed him for free the first time because she said he had her son's eyes, and who told him on the 3rd visit that the name Esrescal was not a name a sensible human said aloud. "Then I will say it like a fool," Emilio said. "Where do I find him?" She looked at him for a long moment over the steam. "You are going to die here, child." "Probably." She wiped her hands. "Try the bone market, sub-level 4 under the old transit junction. Ask for a human called Rays. Do not tell him I sent you." He went that night. The bone market sold things that the upper towers did not believe in. He walked through it with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the floor, and he passed stalls hung with curing meats that did not come from any animal he could name, and tables spread with weapons that were older than his colony, and a Sithari child sitting cross-legged behind a glass case of teeth, sorting them by size. He passed a stall where a thin Tellurian was selling identification papers under a lamp shaped like a human skull, and another where a pelt with milky eyes was offering to read fortunes from the pattern of veins in a man's wrist. He kept his head down. He did not stop. He found Rays at the back, sitting on an overturned crate next to a brazier, sharing a smoke with a woman who left as soon as Emilio approached. Rays turned out to be a thin man with prison ink crawling up his neck, and a laugh like a cough. "Esrescal," Rays said. Sure, kid, everybody wants Esrescal, you got money." "No." "Then you got nothing." Rays leaned closer. "But I'll tell you for free because I like your face. Esrescal doesn't keep humans on Volcaron, he moves them out. The pens are down well in the throat near the old reactor vaults. You go down there looking, you don't come back up. You hear me, kid? You don't come back up." "How do I get down there?" Rays stared at him. Then he laughed his coughing laugh and shook his head and walked away. Emilio stood at the brazier for a long moment after Rays had gone. The coals shifted. Across the aisle, the pelt fortune teller was watching him with her milky eyes. She lifted one long finger and beckoned. He went over. "You will not find your sister tonight," she said, without taking his wrist. "But you will not die tonight either. That is the bargain. Do you accept it?" "Do I have a choice?" "No," she said, "but it is more polite to ask." He nodded. He thanked her, because he did not know what else to do, and he walked out of the bone market and back up the lift to his flophouse with the smell of the brazier in his clothes, and the words "you will not die tonight" asterisk moving in slow circles in his head. Emilio went home to his cot. He opened the folded cloth from his mother for the first time. Inside was a small flat disc of dried masa, the kind she used to press for him when he was a boy and could not sleep. He held it in his palm, and he thought of her hands shaping it in the dark kitchen the morning he left, and he ate half of it and put the other half back in the cloth and folded it carefully against his chest. He did not weep, not yet. He worked the yard for 14 more days. He saved 19 chits. He asked his questions. He learned the names of the lifts that ran down into the throat and the names of the gangs that controlled them. He learned which lift operators took bribes and which took fingers. He was building a map in his head, slow and crooked. The way his sister's smile was crooked, and on the 15th night, walking back to the flophouse through an alley he had taken 100 times, he heard something behind a dumpster that stopped him. There were small things he had learned in those 14 days that he did not know he had learned. He had learned to read the angle of a foreman's chin and tell whether the day's work would be the kind a man walked away from. He had learned that the Tellurian dockmaster in Vault 9 paid in chits, while the Virethi dockmaster in Vault 11 paid in scrip that could be spent only at company-affiliated stalls, which were 40% more expensive, and that this was not an accident. He had learned that the woman at the noodle cart at Vault 9 was called Mama Choi, and that she had crossed 3 colonies as a girl, and that she had buried 2 sons in the throat, one to fever and one to a knife, and that she fed Emilio for free not because he had her son's eyes but because she had decided, in the way that lonely people decide things, that she could not bear to bury a third. He had learned to sleep in 20-minute pieces. He had learned that the cough on his tier was not lung rust but something worse, a Volcaron disease the humans called gutter lung, that came from the recycled air in the deep stacks, and that there was no medicine for and that killed slow. He had learned that the boy with the missing fingers was called Keto, and that he was not 12 but 9, and that his sister, who was 7, ran with him and slept against his back in a culvert 4 blocks from the yard, and that they had no parents either alive or dead, only an absence where parents should have been. He had given Keto 3 chits once, and Keto had taken them with the grave, careful hands of a much older man and said, "Gracias, hermano." In Spanish he had learned somewhere and kept, and Emilio had walked away that night with his throat closed and his eyes burning and had stood at the railing of a skyway for a long time looking down into nothing. He had not slept that night. He had taken out the folded cloth and held it without opening it and thought of his mother and his sister and Keto's sister and the old engineer under the recycler. And he had thought, for the first time in his life with clear and steady words, that the galaxy was not a thing that could be lived in honestly without becoming either cruel or broken, and that he did not yet know which he would be, and that the not knowing was a thing he would have to carry. In the morning he had gone back to the yard, he had worked, he had asked his questions. That was the shape of his 14 days. On the 15th night, walking back through the alley, he heard the sound. It was not a cry. It was the absence of a cry, the wet, choked sound of someone trying very hard not to make one. He should have walked on. Marisol had told him this, and the noodle woman had told him this, and the boy with the missing fingers had told him this. On Volcaron you did not stop for sounds in alleys. You walked. You looked down. You went home. He stopped. He stepped around the dumpster. She was crumpled against the wall in a pool of dark fluid that was not quite blood and not quite oil. Virethi. He knew the silhouette, the long tapering skull, the second pair of shorter arms folded beneath the first, the iridescent plating along the spine. She was tall even sitting, taller than he was standing, and her cloak was torn open across the chest where something had punched a wide, ragged hole. One of her 4 hands was pressed against the wound. The other 3 were trembling. Her eyes opened, 2 large, the inner pair small and set deeper, all 4 the color of wet brass. They focused on him with a precision that did not match the rest of her body, and he understood, without knowing how he understood, that she was deciding whether to kill him. He raised his empty hands. I'm not anyone," he said in common. "I'm nobody, I'm just walking." Her mouth moved. The Virethi did not have lips the way humans did. The jaw was hinged differently, and the sound came out wet and rasping. Then walk. He looked at her, he looked at the wound, he looked at the puddle which was spreading. He thought of his sister. "You're going to die," he said. "Yes. There's a clinic 3 streets over, humans only, but I would be killed there inside an hour. Walk away, human." He stood. The alley was very quiet. Somewhere far above, a skyline hummed. "My mother," he said, "told me once that the only sin she could not forgive was walking past." The Virethi looked at him. Something moved in the deeper pair of eyes, something that might have been amusement, or might have been pity, or might have been the beginning of a calculation he could not read. Then you will die with me, she said. They are coming back. Who? Soon. He crouched. He looked at the wound. He had patched men in the oar shafts. He had stitched his own arm when a drill bit had thrown back. He had once held the hand of a boy whose leg the rock crusher had taken, and the boy had lived. He did not know Virethi anatomy. He knew pressure. He knew that fluid leaving a body had to be slowed. He pulled off his thermal liner. He folded it. He pressed it against the hole in her chest with both hands. She hissed. Her smaller arms came up and gripped his wrists with a strength that startled him, not crushing, but absolute. The way of vice was absolute. I am not a small woman, she said. You cannot carry me. I'm not going to carry you, I'm going to drag you. There's a service lift 1 block east. It goes down. I know a human who has a room down there, 12 flights, 6 minutes. They will see us. Then we go fast. She studied him. Her 4 hands all moved at once, 3 releasing his wrists, 1 taking the thermal liner and pressing it harder against her own wound. Why, she said. Why what? Why are you doing this? He looked her in the eyes, all 4 of them. He could not have said, then or later, what passed between them in that moment. Only that he answered her honestly, because she had asked honestly, and because on Volcaron no one had asked him an honest question since he had arrived. I'm looking for my sister, he said. If I walk past you, I have no right to keep looking. He did not see her face change. The Virethi face did not change the way a human face changed. But the smaller pair of eyes narrowed, fractionally, and the larger pair widened, and her 4 hands closed and opened once, in a gesture he would learn later was the Virethi equivalent of a long, slow exhale. Then drag me, human. He dragged her. It took 8 minutes, not 6, because she lost consciousness twice, and he had to stop and check that she was still breathing, and once because a Sithari patrol passed the mouth of the alley, and he had to flatten both of them against the wall behind a stack of crates, and hold his breath until the priest's wheeled platform's word passed. Her blood, or whatever it was, soaked through his shirt and dried in tacky stripes along his forearms. When he finally got her into the service lift and slammed the gate and punched the descent stud, his hands were shaking so hard he had to use both of them to do it. The lift fell 12 stories into the cinder. He sat with his back against the wall and her head against his thigh and watched the floor counters tick down. She breathed in shallow stutters. The smaller pair of eyes were closed. The larger pair were half open, glassy, fixed on nothing. Reyes opened his door on the second knock. Kid, he said. Kid, what the kid? You said you liked my face. I didn't say I liked it that much. She'll die in the hallway. Reyes looked past him at the Virethi slumped against the lift gate. He looked at the size of her. He looked at the wound. He looked at Emilio's face. He swore in 3 languages and stepped aside. Get her in. Christ, kid, Christ. They got her onto Reyes's cot. Reyes, it turned out, had been a field medic in a war Emilio had never heard of, on a planet whose name he did not know. He worked on her for 4 hours. He swore the entire time. He sent Emilio out twice, once for a particular kind of sealant from a vendor he named, once for a bottle of clear alcohol that Reyes drank half of before he finished the stitching. He did not ask who she was. He did not ask why Emilio had brought her. He worked. When he was done, he sat down on the floor with his back against the cot and looked at Emilio and said, You know what you've done. I helped someone. You've helped a Virethi, in the cinder. Whoever wanted her dead is going to come looking. They are going to come looking here. Tonight maybe, tomorrow certain. Emilio looked at the woman on the cot. The thermal liner, soaked through and crusted, lay folded beside her. Her 4 hands rested across her abdomen. Her breathing had steadied. Then we move her again in the morning. Where, kid? Where do you move a wounded Virethi in this city where nobody sees? Emilio did not answer. He sat down on the floor beside Reyes. He took the folded cloth from his shirt. He opened it and broke the half-disc of masa in two and held one piece out to Reyes, who looked at it for a long moment and then took it. And the two of them ate his mother's bread in the small, smoke-yellow light of a stolen room 12 stories under the skin of Valkaran. They did not speak for a while. Reyes leaned his head back against the cot and closed his eyes and chewed slowly, the way a man chews who has not eaten anything made by another person's hands in a long time. The Virethi woman breathed in her shallow stutters above them. Somewhere through the wall a couple was fighting in a language full of sibilants, and somewhere else a small child was being sung to in a language Emilio almost recognized. The pipes in the ceiling ticked as they cooled. The light from the single overhead strip was the color of old butter. "Where you from, kid?" Reyes said finally. "Cerro Verde." "Never heard of it." "Nobody has." "It a mining moon." "Yes." "They all are." Reyes opened one eye. "What did your father do?" "Or picker, same as me, until he didn't." "Until he didn't." Reyes nodded slowly. "My father was a baker in a city you never heard of either, on a planet that's not there anymore. He used to wake up at 2 in the morning and start the ovens. I'd come down before dawn and he'd hand me a roll right out of the oven, too hot to hold, and I'd toss it from one hand to the other until it cooled. 41 years ago. I still wake up at 2 in the morning sometimes. I don't know why my body remembers him better than I do." He did not open the other eye. He chewed. "What do you do now?" Emilio said. "Now I drink. I stitch the occasional knife wound. I tell people to walk past alleys." He laughed his coughing laugh quietly so as not to wake the Virethi. "I'm bad at my own advice, kid. So are you. That's why we're sitting here." "That's why we're sitting here." They finished the bread. Reyes folded the cloth himself, carefully, and handed it back to Emilio, and Emilio put it in his shirt pocket against his ribs. Outside, somewhere far above them, a skyline hummed, and the city went on breathing its long, slow breath, and neither of them slept that night, though both of them pretended to. She woke in the morning. Her 4 eyes opened all at once, which Emilio would learn was unusual. The Virethi normally woke in stages, smaller eyes first, the larger pair last, as a protective reflex evolved on a homeworld where things hunted in the dawn. She woke all at once, and she sat up all at once, and Reyes, who had been dozing against the wall, jerked awake and reached for a sidearm he had not carried in 11 years. She looked at the two of them. She looked at the stitching across her chest. She looked at the empty bottle of clear alcohol on the floor. She made a sound that was, Emilio thought, possibly a laugh. "You are not professionals," she said. "No, ma'am," Reyes said. She turned the brass eyes on Emilio. "What is your name, human?" "Emilio Vargas." "Emilio Vargas." She said it carefully, as if measuring the syllables. "I owe you a debt I cannot repay in this room. I will need to leave this city, quickly. There are people who believe I am dead, and they must continue to believe so for another 4 standard days, after which they will not believe so any longer no matter what I do. I require a vessel. I require a pilot. I require silence." Reyes laughed his coughing laugh. "Lady, what you require is a miracle." "Then I require a miracle." She looked at Emilio. "And you, Emilio Vargas? What do you require?" He looked at her for a long time. "I'm looking for my sister," he said. "She was taken. She is somewhere down in the throat in the pens, a man named Esrescal." She moved one of her smaller hands. It was a small gesture, almost lazy. But Reyes saw it and went very still, and Emilio did not yet know why. "Esrescal," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You came to Valkaran to find a sister taken by Esrescal." "Yes." "You walked into an alley last night and saved a stranger's life when you had no chit to spare and no reason to stop." "Yes, ma'am." "And you ask me for nothing." I didn't think you could." "Emilio Vargas." She leaned forward. The wound must have pulled, she did not show it. Listen to me. I will leave this city within the day. When I leave, you will leave with me. Your sister will be on the vessel before we make the jump. Do you understand me? No, ma'am. That is acceptable. Understand it later. She turned to Rays. You, field medic, you will come also if you wish. I have employment for a man who can stitch a Virethi in 4 hours with stolen sealant and stay sober enough not to kill her. I wasn't sober. Then I have employment for a man who can do it drunk. Ray stared at her. Lady, he said, who asterisk are you? She did not answer him. She turned back to Emilio and held out her uppermost right hand. It was a Virethi gesture, not a human one. He learned later that it was the gesture of a sworn bond between equals, and that to offer it was rare, and that to offer it to an off-worlder was unheard of. He did not know any of that. He only knew that she was waiting. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers, there were 6 of them, long, ridged along the inner faces with fine plating, closed around his with extraordinary gentleness. My name, she said, is Verles Thacker. Rays made a small sound. Emilio looked at him. Rays was not laughing anymore. The next 18 hours were the strangest of Emilio's life, and he had already had several strange ones. Verles could not walk far without bleeding, so she sat on Rays's cot wrapped in a stolen cloak, and she gave instructions, and Emilio and Rays carried them out. She knew names. She knew lift codes. She knew which corner of which sub-level had a working comm that was not on any Concord registry, and she knew the sequence of clicks and chirps that would route a signal from that comm to a receiver on a vessel orbiting in the high dark. She made one call. It lasted 11 seconds. When she was finished, she handed the comm back to Emilio and said, "Now we wait 6 hours." For what? For my people to remember who they are. He did not ask. In the 6th hour, the lights in the lower cinder flickered. Not failed, flickered. A single long pulse, then 3 short, then 1 long. Emilio felt it more than saw it. The air seemed to lean. Rays, who had been pouring himself a measure from a fresh bottle, set the bottle down very slowly. Mater de Dios, he whispered. What? That's a Virethi fleet signal, kid. That's an asterisk Imperial asterisk fleet signal. You only ever see it on hollows. You only ever see it when. He stopped. He looked at Verles. He looked at her the way a man looks at a thing he has heard about all his life and never expected to see in a room. You're Rays said. Yes, Verles said. You're asterisk her. Yes. You're the. Yes. The Virethi Imperium has been at war with the Coalition for 6 years, and you are. Rays, she said, pour me a measure of that, my stitching itches. He poured her a measure. His hands were shaking. Emilio looked between them. I don't understand, he said. Verles took the cup in her uppermost left hand and looked at him over the rim of it. The 4 brass eyes were very steady. I command the Virethi Imperial Fleet, Emilio Vargas. The army your kind calls asterisk the asterisk army when they say it in their bars and their bedrooms. 390,000 warships, 16 million soldiers under direct oath. I am the 3rd of my line to hold the standard, and I am, at this moment, the most hunted person in the galaxy, because 4 days ago my cousin made an attempt on my life with the help of a coalition financier and 3 of my own house guard, and he has spent these 4 days announcing to the worlds that I am dead, and that he sits the standard in my place. Silence in the room. And now, Emilio said. And now, Verles said, he has 6 hours to enjoy his chair. She drank. The fleet did not come down. Fleets like the Virethi Imperial Fleet did not come down to Volcaron. The conquered patrol citadels would have engaged them, treaties or no, and the city would have burned. Instead, one small, fast vessel detached from the high dark and slid down through the cloud deck like a knife slipping into a sheath, and it set down on a private landing pad on the roof of a tower whose owner, it turned out, had owed Verlies's house a favor for 50 years. Getting there was the hard part. Reyes drove. He had borrowed asterisk was the word he used, with a face that suggested otherwise, a battered freight hauler from the Bone Market, and the three of them rode in the cab with Verlies folded sideways across the back bench and Emilio crammed into the footwell because there was not room for both of them and Reyes had to be at the wheel. They climbed through the cinder in a slow grinding spiral, lift to lift, ramp to ramp. Twice they were stopped at checkpoints. Twice Verlies, without sitting up, recited a string of identifier codes in a Virethi dialect Emilio could not follow. And twice, the checkpoint guards stepped back from the hauler with their hands raised, palms out, and waved it through without checking the cargo. "They are not loyal to me yet," she murmured after the second one. "They are loyal to the asterisk possibility of me. It will be enough for another hour." Reyes drove with both hands clamped to the wheel and his shoulders pulled tight up around his ears. He had been quiet since the second checkpoint. Now he spoke without taking his eyes off the road. "Lady," he said, "beg pardon." "Speak. You said your cousin made an attempt 4 days ago, with house guard." "Yes. How'd you live?" She was silent for a long moment. "A girl," she said. "A serving girl, 12 years old, of the Virethi lower caste, who had served my tea every morning for 3 years. She saw the shape of what was about to happen before I did. She put herself between me and the first blade. The blade was meant for my throat, it took hers instead. She bought me 8 seconds, I used them." "What happened to the cousin's men?" "2 of them are dead. 1 escaped. He is the one who shot me here in the alley 3 nights later. He believed I was already weak enough that 1 shot would finish. He was nearly correct." "And the girl?" "Her name was Isvel. Her body is in a refrigeration unit on my flagship. I will bury her on Thacker Prime with the honors of my own house when I have a house again to give honors with. I owe her the same debt I owe Emilio Vargas. It is the second great debt I have incurred this season, and I am beginning to suspect that being saved is a habit I have not yet learned how to repay properly." She closed the brass eyes. She did not speak again for a while. Emilio, in the footwell, thought about the serving girl. He thought about Quito and Quito's sister in the culvert. He thought about how the universe did not weigh small people the way it should, and how sometimes, by accident, by the small private decision of a child or a stranger, the weighing came out right anyway. "And the pens," Emilio said. She turned her head against the bench cushion. "Speak, Emilio Vargas." "My sister." "Yes. You said she would be on the vessel before we made the jump." "She will." "How?" She was silent for a moment. The hauler ground around a bend. "While you and Reyes were arranging our transport, I made a second call," she said, "to a man who has reason to fear me more than he fears Esrescal. He is, at this moment, opening the pens in the throat. Every human in them will be brought up. Your sister will be among them. She will be on the vessel." He could not finish. "I owe you a debt, Emilio Vargas. I do not owe small ones. There are hundreds of people in those pens." There were. He pressed his face against his knees in the footwell of the freight hauler, and he wept. He wept the way his mother had said he would, with the dried half-disc of masa in his shirt pocket pressed against his ribs, and he wept silently because Reyes was driving and Verlies was bleeding and there was no time. He wept for his sister, who he had not yet seen, and for the boy with the missing fingers, and for the woman at the noodle cart who had told him he was going to die here, and for the old engineer who slept under the recycler and spoke only in fragments of a hymn. He wept because for 19 years he had believed that the galaxy was a thing too large for one small human from a dust moon to bend even a little, and in the space of one night and one day, a four-armed woman with brass eyes had bent it for him, because he had not walked past her in an alley. He wept until he was finished, and then he wiped his face with his sleeve, and Verles did not look at him, because she was Varethi and she understood, somehow, that to look at a weeping man was sometimes the same as to push him. Reyes hummed under his breath. It was a tune Emilio knew. His mother had sung it. It was a hymn from a country that did not exist anymore, on a planet that humans had left 2 generations before. "How do you know that song?" Emilio said. "My mother sang it," Reyes said. "Mine too." Reyes did not look at him. He went on driving. He went on humming. They reached the tower. The landing pad was on the 416th floor, and the vessel was already there, low and matte black and shaped like nothing the human eye had evolved to parse. It hurt to look at directly, the way certain deep-sea fish hurt to look at. A ramp extended. 2 Varethi in armored cloaks descended it and crossed the pad toward them, and when they saw Verles they dropped, all 4 limbs to the deck, in a posture Emilio had seen only in religious hollows. "My lady," one of them said, "we were told." "I know what you were told. Stand. We have less than 90 seconds. Where are the humans?" "Loading on the secondary pad, my lady. 211 of them. We took the pens in 19 minutes. "Casualties?" "There's none of ours." "Esrescal?" "Alive, my lady. We were uncertain whether you would prefer to see him alive." "I would bring him. Emilio Vargas." Emilio was already moving. He stumbled out of the cab and across the pad with Reyes a step behind him, and a Varethi guard a step behind Reyes, and they went up the ramp and into the vessel, and through a corridor that smelled of ozone and a kind of resin he did not know, and they came out into a bay where 211 humans were standing or sitting or lying on the deck plates, blinking under the lights, holding each other. He saw her. She was thinner. Her hair had been shorn close to the skull. There was a mark on her cheek that had not been there before. She was wearing a stained shift that hung off one shoulder, and she was holding the hand of a younger girl who was crying, and when she saw him she did not move. She just stood. Her mouth opened a little. Her eyes, their father's eyes, dark and slow to trust, went very wide. "Millie," she said. It was what she had called him when she was small. He crossed the bay. He did not run. He walked, because if he ran his legs would not hold him. Around him the freed humans were turning to look, some of them flinching back, having learned in the pens that a man moving with purpose was a man to be afraid of. Others, the older ones, the ones who still remembered, saw the way he was walking and the way the girl was standing and understood, and stepped aside, and one woman with a face like a cracked plate put her hand over her mouth and began to cry without sound. He reached her and he took her face between his hands and he said her name, and she said his, and the younger girl beside her looked up at the 2 of them and then quietly let go of Lucia's hand and stepped back to give them the moment. "Mama," Lucia said after a long time, "is Mama?" "Mama is fine. Mama is waiting. We are going to her. Lucia, we are going to her." She put her forehead against his collarbone and she did not cry, because she had cried all her crying weeks ago in a place he would never ask her about. He held her. He felt the shape of her small skull under his hand. He felt the patched thermal liner he was no longer wearing, gone now into the wound of an alien queen, and he felt the cloth of his shirt against his sister's cheek, and he closed his eyes. He held her for a long time. He could feel her ribs against his forearm. There were too many of them, and they were too close to the skin. She smelled of something acrid he did not recognize, and beneath that of the particular sour-sweet that hunger makes of a person, and beneath that, faintly, of the shampoo their mother had bought for her 2 birthdays ago, which she must somehow have kept a tiny bottle of through all of it, and which she must have rationed drop by drop, and the thought of his sister rationing the smell of home through 8 weeks in a Varethi pen made something inside him break very quietly. In a way he understood would never quite reset. He did not let her see it. He held her, and he stroked the close-shorn skull, and he hummed, almost inaudibly, the same fragment of hymn his mother had sung to both of them on the nights the heater failed. She heard it. She lifted her head a little. "Mama's song," she said. "Mama's song. I forgot the words." "That's all right. I'll teach you them again. We have time now." She nodded against his collarbone. The younger girl who had been holding her hand was standing a few feet away, watching them with the careful, hungry eyes of a child who has not been touched kindly in a long time. Emilio met her gaze over his sister's head, and he held out his free hand, and after a long hesitation she came forward and took two of his fingers in her small fist, the way Lucia had taken his sleeve in the medical bay later, and he held her too, because he had hands enough for both of them, and because his mother had told him once that the only sin she could not forgive was walking past. When he opened his eyes, Verles was standing in the entrance of the bay, leaning on one of her guards, watching. Their eyes met across the heads of 211 freed humans. She inclined her head, a small formal gesture, the Virethi acknowledgement of a debt closed. He inclined his back. He did not know how to do it correctly. He did it anyway. She accepted it the way she had accepted the thermal liner, without comment, as a thing given honestly. The ramp closed. The vessel lifted. They made the jump 14 minutes later from the high dark above Valkaron, and when the stars went sideways and then stilled again, Emilio was sitting on a bench in the medical bay with Lucia asleep against his shoulder, and Reyes was sitting across from him with a fresh bottle and an expression Emilio could not read, and Verles was being walked slowly, by two of her people, up and down the corridor outside, because her physician had said that she had to walk every hour or the stitches would seize, and she was. Despite everything, doing what her physician told her. She paused at the open hatch. "Emilio Vargas," she said. He looked up. "Your sister?" "Yes." "She is the reason you came?" "Yes." "And now?" He looked down at Lucia's sleeping face. He thought about the dust moon. He thought about his mother in the kitchen, pressing masa. He thought about the radio tower where his father had died. He thought about the noodle woman and the boy with the missing fingers and the old engineer who sang fragments of a hymn. "I don't know," he said. "Good," said Verles. "Not knowing is the beginning of every interesting answer. Walk with me a moment when she is settled. There is a thing I wish to say to you." He nodded. She moved on. He stayed with Lucia until she stirred and woke and saw him and was sure, in the small reorienting way of a person who has been dreaming the same dream for many nights, that he was real. Then he eased her down onto the bench and tucked a folded cloak under her head and stepped out into the corridor. Verles was waiting at the far bulkhead. The two guards stood at a discreet distance. She inclined her head and he fell in beside her, and the two of them walked, slowly, the long curving passage that ran the spine of the vessel. She did not speak for a while. When she did, her voice was low. "On Thacker Prime there is a custom," she said. "When a debt cannot be repaid in coin or in service, the debtor offers the creditor a name. The name is a small one, a syllable, sometimes two. It is the name the creditor may call the debtor by in private, after which the debtor is bound to come, whenever called, for as long as both live. It is a serious offering. It is not made lightly. I have made it twice in my life. Once to my mother when I was 3 and she pulled me from a river. Once to the girl Isvel the morning before she died, though I did not know then that I was making it. I would like, if you will permit, to make it a third time." He stopped walking. "My lady," he said, because he did not know what else to say. "You will not call me that when we are alone. You will call me Verles because that is my name and you have earned the use of it. And you will give me, in return, a single syllable by which I may call you in private. Do you understand?" He thought about it for a long time. The corridor hummed around them. Somewhere far ahead, in the bridge, an officer was calling out vector adjustments in a voice he could not hear properly. "Millie," he said finally. "Millie. It is what my sister called me when she was small. It is the part of my name that belongs to the people who love me." Verlies was silent. Then she said very gently, "Then I will use it carefully, Millie, and only when it is earned. Do you accept?" "I accept." She inclined her head once more, the slow Virethi inclination of a vow taken. They walked on. After a while she spoke again, more lightly, as if to set the weight down. "Your sister will require a great deal of patience," she said. "What was done to her in the pens will take years to undo. Some of it will not undo at all. You should know this now, so that you do not expect it to be otherwise." "I know." "Good, there will be physicians on Thacker Prime, the best the Imperium has. They are yours for as long as she needs them. Also a tutor if she wishes to learn, and a quiet house in the lower valleys where the air is good. These things are not gifts. They are payment. Do not refuse them." "I won't." "And your mother?" "Yes." "A vessel will be sent to Cerro Verde within the standard week. She will be brought to you, with whatever of her belongings she wishes to bring, and with whatever of her neighbors she wishes to bring with her. I do not separate families twice." He could not speak for a moment. "Rays," he managed, "will be offered employment at a salary that he will find offensive. He will accept it anyway because he is a tired man, and because he has just discovered that he is not finished. You may tell him I said so." "I'll tell him." They had reached the end of the corridor. She turned to face him. The four brass eyes were tired but very clear. "Millie," she said. "Yes." "I will ask one thing of you now, and after this I will not ask again for a long time." "Ask." "Do not become careful." He waited. "You will be, very shortly, a man with a great deal to lose, a sister, a mother, a house, the friendship of an empress, which is a heavy and dangerous kind of friendship. People will tell you, as people always tell men in your position, that you must now be careful, that you must walk past alleys, that you must not stop for sounds in the dark. I am asking you to ignore them. I am asking you to remain the man who put his shirt on a wound." He looked at her for a long time. "I'll try," he said. "That is enough. Go and sleep, Millie. There will be a great deal to do in the morning." He nodded. He turned to go. "And Emilio Vargas," she said, in the formal voice now the public voice. "Yes, my lady." "Thank you." He bowed his head. He went back down the corridor to the medical bay, and he lay down on the bench beside his sleeping sister, and for the first time in 19 days he slept the whole way through. In the years afterward, the historians would argue. They would argue about the morning. The Virethi Imperial fleet appeared in the sky over Thacker Prime, and the Pretender's flag came down from the spire of the Standard, and was burned by his own house guard before Verlies's vessel had even made planetfall. They would argue about the 6-year war with the coalition that ended, in its 7th month after her return, not with a treaty but with a single broadcast in which the Empress of the Virethi spoke for 11 minutes, in plain common, on the subject of debts and how they were paid. They would argue about the founding of the Cinder Accord, the first interspecies labor protection ever ratified by the conquered, which Verlies forced through the upper chamber over 4 months of patient, brutal politics, and which freed, in its first year, 800,000 human migrants from indenture across 40 worlds. They would argue about why she did these things, and whether her motives were strategic or sentimental, and whether the wound on her chest had perhaps been deeper than the surgeons had said, and whether a person could be changed in a single night by the hands of a stranger on a folded thermal liner. They would argue about the boy from the yard, Kido, who was found 3 weeks after the accord was signed by an envoy in plain clothes who knew exactly where to look, and who was brought with his small sister to Thacker Prime and educated there, and grew up to be, eventually, the Empress's most trusted intelligence officer in the human territories. A man who never lost his missing fingers and never wore gloves to hide them, and who said, when asked, that the fingers had been left in the lower cinder on purpose, so that he would not forget where he came from. They would argue about Mama Choi, who was offered a passage off Volcaron and politely declined, because, she said, the noodles needed her, and who instead received, every standard month for the rest of her life, a small unmarked envelope of chits that always arrived on the first morning of the month, and that she never spoke of to anyone, though everyone in the cinder knew. They would argue about Reyes, who became chief of the Empress's personal medical staff, and who died, of the gutter lung he had been hiding for years, on a balcony on Thacker Prime, looking down at the lower valleys, with a half-empty bottle in one hand and Emilio's hand in the other, humming a fragment of the hymn from a country that no longer existed. They would argue about whether the Empress wept at his funeral, and the historians who said she did not were the historians who had not been there. Some of them, the more careful ones, would note that on every standard day for the rest of her reign, the Empress of the Virethi opened her morning audience by breaking a small disk of dried human bread between her uppermost hands and placing half of it on the dais beside her throne, where it remained, untouched, until evening. They would note that no one ever asked her why. They would note that no one ever needed to. Emilio Vargas lived to be 87. He served, for 41 of those years, as the Empress's personal envoy to the human colonies, and he traveled in that time to every dust moon and frontier crater and Orcshaft settlement the conquered had ever forgotten to count, and he spoke at each of them in the same plain Spanish his mother had taught him, and he ate, at each of them, whatever bread the local people pressed into his hands. He never lost the habit of stopping in alleys. When he died, in a small white room in the high tower his Empress had built for him on Thacker Prime, with Lucia at one side of his bed and a very old, very tall, four-armed woman at the other, the last thing he said was the name of his mother, and the second to last thing was a fragment of a hymn from a country that did not exist anymore. Verles Thacker, Empress of the Virethi, holder of the standard, commander of 390,000 warships and 16 million soldiers under direct oath, sat with him through the night and into the morning, and when the sun came up over the spires of her capital she rose, and she walked out onto the high balcony, and she stood looking down at the city for a long time. Then she lifted her uppermost right hand, slowly, into the empty air, and she held it there, as if waiting for someone to take it. For a long time. For as long as it took.